morning, everybody. Well, this is exciting. I was afraid when you heard the topic, everybody would go fleeing for the other class. But so this is good. I hope you're interested in the history. Some might ask why. And well, first question, I suppose some might ask, is it Philistines or Philistines? I was actually watching a video, YouTube video the other day, and it must have been AI generated, the voice, because it sounded a little strange. But he actually alternated. A couple times be Steens, a couple times be Steins. It's like, all right, make up your mind. But you might ask, why this study? Philistines and giants. Part of the answer for me is because I'm still 12 years old, and this is cool. That's what got me started out. Philistines and giants are just a cool topic. Becky will confirm that my sense of humor hasn't progressed past age 12. But also, if we take the tact that the Bible doesn't contain any extraneous information, nothing in there that's not important, then the Philistines and the giants are in there for some reason. Why are they there? What lessons are we supposed to derive from this? You know, in the past, for Israel, we see that God worked with Israel through the people around them. And we also see sometimes that God works in ways that we wouldn't expect. And we see that God is powerful and he's faithful. And I think through the Philistines and the giants, we will see those things. But then, I would ask, what's the point for us? Who or what are Philistines and giants today? Is there such a thing today? I think the answer is yes. We'll talk about that. Also, just along the way, as I was studying this topic, I was really struck by, I don't know if you want to call them undesigned coincidences or not, but just the number of times that as I was going through it, I would get a little information here, and I'd get a couple of words there, and a couple of more words here, and it would paint this picture so I could say, oh, maybe this is how it happened. And it was just really interesting to me how the Bible, across hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000 years, filled in these gaps that I was wondering about. So, see if we can get this to work. There's our outline. You know, we'll look at the biblical account, obviously, and we'll see history and lessons for Israel at the same time, because they're inextricably linked. The history of the Philistines, who were they and why were they? And both the history and the lessons are just inextricably combined there. Same with giants. Who were they? Why were they? Joe?
This is a good question. Are you going to go back to the Nephilim in the Old Testament?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
I just didn't want to...
Yeah. Slow down. Slow down, Joe. We'll get there. In gory detail. Some people may want to go fleeing now. But yes. Then there are Philistine giants. Not all giants were Philistines. And then there's even a way that Jerusalem and Jesus fit into this story. And then we'll look at our lessons for today. Who or what are our Philistines and giants today? And what purpose do they serve? And what do they say about our faith and our resolve? But as we look at this history and these lessons, I really want to try to avoid rabbit holes. You know, this is not meant to be about Samson. And it's not meant to be about David. That's inevitable that we'll talk about them, but I want to minimize that. I don't want to get too far afield with the subject. So if we start looking at the Philistines, you know, the Bible gives a more or less straightforward account. But first I'd like to briefly discuss, I said no rabbit holes, but first thing we're going to do is a rabbit hole. I briefly want to discuss archaeology and dates. First, dates. You know, the Philistines appear both before and after the Exodus. They seem kind of different before and after. You know, Abraham and Isaac interacted with the Philistines. And it would seem that they were not who they were when the Israelites were then interacting with them. They were smaller and apparently weaker, and you know, the king of the Philistines at that time had a healthy respect for Abraham and his family and what he was able to do. But from an archaeological perspective, their movements and their appearance on the scene really seem to coincide more with the movements and appearance on the scene of the Hebrews in the land. And that's another question. Boy, why is that? How is that the Philistines seem to come into the land more or less about the same time as the Israelites did? Kind of. Maybe. Kind of. You know, and archaeologists apply dates. But these dates really can make us scratch our heads too, wondering how they mesh with biblical dates. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So, because the timeline for the Philistines' appearance on the scene seems to coincide more or less with the Exodus, there's a little bit before, there's a lot after. Let's try to establish a date for the Exodus. Does anybody have a date in their head for when the Exodus occurred? 1446? Okay. Anybody else have another date? The date I always had in my head is 1492. That's, you know, if you're familiar with Bishop Ussher, he created this whole chronology of the Bible, in fact, my first Bible had Ussher's dates at the top of every single page. So to me, it was practically canon that, okay, that's when it happened. And 1492, that's an easy date to remember, right? You know, it's like, okay, 1492 AD, we've got Columbus sailing the ocean blue. 1492 BC, we've got the Exodus. But these dates aren't set in stone. They just aren't. And like I said, when we look at the dates that we see from archaeology and the dates that we think might be the case from the Bible, they just don't mesh. They can cause more problems than they solve. Anybody have or seen one or both of these books? You know, I think they're really interesting. The one on the left, I have both of them. The one on the left, the wall chart of world history, it folds out, so it like stretches from the end of the table to about here, and you can see all of history all lined up. And like there's, you can make out that page. You see, you've got coming out of the Tower of Babel. There, you've got Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And down at the bottom, somebody thinks that was Noah himself, actually then going off to populate China. Who knows where that comes from? But you know, I can just get completely lost in this book. I can see what was happening around the world at the same time. And, you know, broadly, it's probably more or less accurate. Very interesting stuff. But the dates can be a real problem. And this book is based off of Bishop Ussher, and it says 1492 for the Exodus. But what I want to do is take a moment. I'm going to watch a video. There's a Facebook page out there, this guy named Nat, who goes into all kinds of, he's obsessed. He says on his page, I'm going to use this little corner of the internet to show how archaeology, history, and historical criticism are no threat to faith. They can be, if misapplied, misused, but they don't have to be. So I'm going to get this video cooking. I think the sound will be okay for those of us here in the room, but I've got the closed captioning on here just in case that's not true for folks at home. So this video takes a little bit of time, but I think it's very, very interesting. Might be something you've never thought about before.
The Exodus. People bring it up with me all the time.
Can you turn that
They
up?
often
Walter?
hold their views on the topic passionately, and sadly from personal experience, some are happy to end friendships with those who hold a different view to theirs. What we're going to do in this video is show how there is no one biblical date for the Exodus. There are in fact quite a few. So let's get started. The passage most people start and finish with is 1 Kings 6 verse 1. It's pretty clear. In the 480th year, after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Now, Solomon started building the temple in 966 BCE, so let's do some simple maths, adding those 480 years. When we do that, we get a date of 1446 for the Exodus. That's it. Pretty easy to work out, right? Let's stick that date on a timeline. There it is. And that is where most people stop. However, we've been reading that passage as it's recorded in the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Septuagint is an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint manuscripts we have are quite a lot older than the oldest Hebrew Masoretic manuscripts we've got, and in some places there are differences between the Hebrew and the Greek. What does the Septuagint say in 1 Kings 6 verse 1? And it came to pass in the 440th year after the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt. That is a 40-year difference. If we do the maths, we end up with a different date of 1406 BCE. The thing is, this is just as biblical a date as we read in the Masoretic text, so let's stick it on our timeline. There we go. Okay, that's 2 biblical dates so far. Let's now go over to the New Testament and read Acts 13, verses 18 to 22. For about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. After he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance for about 450 years. After that, he gave them judges until the time of the prophet Samuel. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, who reigned for 40 years. When he had removed him, he made David their king. Okay, that's a fair bit of chronological information right there. Let's lay it out. 40 years in the wilderness, unspecified period of time conquering the land, 450 years living in their inheritance. After that period, the period of the judges, then 40 years reign of Saul, then the 40-year reign of David, which you get from a different passage, and then those 4 years into Solomon's reign when he began to build the temple. So when we add up those figures, we get 574 years between the beginning of the Exodus and the 4th year of Solomon's reign. And that is not including those periods that we're not given a duration for. So it's more than 574 years, but we'll stick with that figure for now. Math time. When we add up those dates, we get a new date for the Exodus of 1540 BCE. And that's quite different to the previous 2 biblical dates. So let's put it on our chart. And there we go. That's at the start of the late Bronze Age, the yellow section on the timeline. The Middle Bronze Age, highlighted in dark red, had only just closed. Okay, so that's 3 biblical dates we've got now, and counting. Next, let's take a look at the narrative time periods, that is, the chronological information embedded in the biblical narratives. You can see here lots of chronological data working back from the 4th year of Solomon's reign all the way back to the beginning of the Exodus. I've taken this list from James Hoffmeyer's paper entitled "What is the Biblical Date for the Exodus?" It doesn't factor in co-regencies and it doesn't factor in potentially overlapping periods, but it's accurate enough to make the point, and the point is this. The narrative time periods add up to around 630 years. When we add that up, that produces our 4th and final biblical date of the Exodus, of 1596 BCE. Let's put that on our chart. What's clear here is that there's more than one biblical date, and that they're spread over a period almost 200 years, and yet they're each as biblical as each other. Depending on your view of Scripture, that is a big problem. Maybe archaeological evidence can help us out. Let's take a look at 2 relevant discoveries, starting with supply cities. We read in Exodus 1 verse 11 that they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. A biblical Ramses is a site known today as Cantir, and its construction began in around 1270 BCE. If we put that on our chart, we'll see that it doesn't fit any of our biblical dates. It's not even close. The biblical dates have the Israelites leaving Egypt between around 130 to 320 years before they even started to build Ramses. This isn't adding up. Our second bit of archaeological evidence that we're going to take a swift look at is the population decline and explosion in Canaan. The archaeological evidence of what's known as the Israelite settlement in Canaan and the population explosion that went along with it never seems to get an airing when discussing the date of the Exodus, and yet it's amongst the most relevant bits of archaeological evidence to our topic that there is. Here's why. There's an undisputed and very clear pattern of settlement that happened in the Canaanite highlands starting in around 1200 BCE. That's the beginning of the Iron Age. At the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1550 BCE, there were 248 sites in the Canaanite highlands. Over the next 350 years, that number collapsed down to 29 at the end of the Late Bronze Age and beginning of Iron Age 1. You'd expect, based on any and all of the biblical dates, that there'd be a population explosion in Canaan during this period as the Israelites arrived and settled. That is not what we see. We see population collapse. Very significantly, there is clear evidence of a population explosion in the region, starting at around the beginning of the Iron Age 1, so that by the end of Iron Age 1, there are 254 sites. and at the end of Iron Age 2, in 586 BCE, there were 520 sites. Using different models, different numbers of sites come out, but what's important is the pattern. Everyone agrees that at around 1200 BCE, an extensive program of settlement began across the Canaanite highlands. Here's a quote from the Oxford History of the Biblical World.
My husband never looked back at his old suit pants after I gifted him these. 60 and 70, my husband feels...
This extraordinary
where do you get
increase
those?
in population in Iron 1 cannot be explained only by natural population growth. There must have been a major influx of people into the highlands in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. So the Israelites emerged in Canaan in around 1200 BCE. Let's put those population figures on our chart. You can see the collapse from 248 sites in the Canaanite highlands at the end of the Middle Bronze to the low of 29 sites at the end of the Late Bronze, and then the population explosion over Iron 1 to 254 sites. From the perspective of dating the Exodus, the implication of this undisputed evidence should be clear. If the Israelites began to settle in Canaan around 1200 BCE, and if they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, then they can't have left Egypt until the early to mid-13th century, say sometime around 1260 BCE, to allow them a few years to conquer Canaan before settling it. Who those newcomers to the Canaanite highlands were and where they came from is a story for another time. The thing is, none of that fits with any of the biblical dates we've seen. The first and hopefully obvious conclusion from all this is that producing biblical chronologies, either in book form, like Ussher's Annals of the World, which by the way has a different date of the Exodus again, or in chart form, like the well-known Adam's Synchronological Chart of History, is a fruitless exercise. The second obvious conclusion is this. Given that the scribes, who've been copying out the scriptures for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, didn't take any of the many opportunities they had to fix or massage the biblical dates of the Exodus so they lined up, shows this. The biblical scribes didn't care about chronological discrepancies. They weren't in the business of providing the raw data required to create chronological charts of biblical history. This shouldn't be a surprise. It wasn't their intention to write history. Scripture tells us what it thinks its purpose is. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for history, for genealogy, and for training in precision, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for producing chronological charts. Sorry, 1 second. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. That is what Scripture is for. How about a passage specifically on the purpose of biblical history? For whatever was written in former days was written for our history education, so that by debating and by the misuse of Scripture we might produce chronological charts. Sorry, I've done it again. 1 second. Whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. There is nothing there that says anything about using Scripture to produce accurate historical chronologies. These passages very clearly teach that the purpose of Scripture is to encourage, to teach righteousness, not to produce chronological charts. Now, that's not to say that Scripture is garbage from a history point of view. As Sommer explains, contrary to what one sometimes reads in the popular press or hears from less learned pulpits, there are no archaeological or historical reasons to doubt the core elements of the Bible's presentation of Israel's history, namely, that the ancestors of the Israelites included an important group who came from Mesopotamia, and that at least some Israelites were enslaved to Egyptians and were surprisingly rescued from Egyptian bondage, that they settled down in the hill country of the land of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age, etc. So, this video hasn't been so much about whether there was an Exodus or not, and for what it's worth, I think there was. It's about whether the biblical writers were concerned with chronological accuracy. It seems to me that the evidence is clear. Scripture is concerned with its narratives, not precise chronologies. So, let's not mishandle the scriptures by trying to make the events they describe fit into a neat and tidy chronological chart. They were never intended for that purpose, and they'll defeat you if you try. So, our conclusion. There is no one biblical date of the Exodus.
All right. So can we firmly establish a date for the Exodus? I don't think we can. Looking at that date range of probably 500 years.
Casey?
But if you're
Casey?
really, yeah.
I just wanted to add one other, just to make it a little more confusing.
Oh, good.
So when you take a look at God's 6,000-year plan, you can be divided up into 3 2,000-year periods. Adam to Abraham, Abraham to Jesus, Jesus to the return of Jesus. So in those sections, you have a 2,000-year period, which is where Abraham is, and then the 400 years after him. So that would place, it would place it at that date, 400 years after Abraham.
Right.
Yeah, I guess the only challenge I would have to the drawing conclusions, the yellow with the population, the Bible really doesn't talk about all that was happening with the Hittites, how the movement of the peoples. It's just the Bible's focused on primarily just the Jews coming in. And so there's a lot that was happening out there that could cause a lot of movements and shifts in population.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and there was a lot of upheaval. It wasn't just upheaval with the Exodus. There was a lot of stuff going on around the world at that time, as we're going to see. So shifting a little bit to archaeology. The archaeological history of the Philistines is murky, and meshing it with biblical history is actually challenging. And about archaeology, very similar to this question about timelines and dates. There's really little archaeological evidence of some of the events that we hold to be true, at least within date ranges and orders of magnitude that we take by faith. For example, archaeologists disagree on the dates when various pharaohs ruled by several hundred years. I'm a little surprised he didn't bring that up in that video. And as I think he mentioned, there's really no record found or a lot of archaeological evidence of people numbering in the millions who were enslaved and who suddenly departed Egypt. Perry, you talked about this a few weeks ago, and when you were talking about where Sinai really is. And yeah, there are chariot wheels that are found, and there's a burnt mountain. And I believe also something that didn't come up at that time, there's hard-packed earth that would suggest millions of people and their stuff traveling this certain route. But there's not a whole lot that we can take from an archaeological perspective that's really firm. These events that we take in detail. Now, for some perspective on this that I think is important for us, there was a post on one of the Christadelphian Facebook pages a while back, and a brother that I respect pretty highly, but his name's Randy Tyra. Most of you probably know him. And I'm going to quote him, and if he knew that I was quoting him, he would be somewhere between appalled and amused that he's coming up in a quote in a Sunday school class. But I think this is a healthy perspective on timelines and archaeology, because there was something was, I don't even remember why it came up, but something was being debated. And he said this: if we base our faith and our ability to fully understand the complexities of scriptures, we are asking to have both our hearts and our faith broken. Discussions of archaeology and history serve to illuminate scripture rather than to substantiate it. If we don't teach such a simple concept, we are asking our students to have their hearts broken and their faith laid waste. When such an attitude is paired with an inflexible view of scripture that demands a very specific understanding, is it any surprise that some folk leave? And you can see that with all of those dates that are all from the Bible. Obviously, there is one true date for the Exodus. But if anybody says it has to be this date because, well, I think that's an answer that we could look forward to knowing at some point in the future, but we can't know it today. I do believe it's possible to mesh archaeology and the Bible. In the case of the Philistines, they just don't walk together in lockstep the way we would hope that they would today. But there's definitely plenty of supporting evidence of the Philistines, and that supporting evidence bolsters our faith and adds color to the story. So now, turning to the Bible with some of that archaeological color. The Philistines are first mentioned in Genesis 10, in what is commonly known as the Table of Nations. This tells us about the descendants of Noah's sons after the flood. And as a general rule, we know that Japheth's sons went north to populate Europe. Shem's sons went east to populate the Middle East and Arabia. And the sons of Ham generally went south into Africa. But they also populated the Middle East, specifically of the sons of Ham. We're told the sons of Ham were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Egypt, did that take me back to where I meant to go? Yeah, it did. Egypt, depending upon the translation you have, it might give the name as Mizraim. That's pretty straightforward. We know where that is. You can see it right there on the map as Mizraim. Cush is generally associated with the people south of Egypt in modern-day Sudan. You can see him there. In Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, all those places high on your tourism list, right? Yeah. Put is to the west of Egypt in modern-day Libya and Tunisia and Algeria. And then, the next few verses down, so Canaan was one of the sons of Ham, back in verse 6. Then in 15 through 18, it says, Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Now, a lot of those names are familiar to us as those that God would help the Israelites to drive out of the land, as described in Deuteronomy here. You can see this overlap. When the Lord brings you into the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. So it's just interesting that we've got that much overlap between Genesis 10 and Deuteronomy 7. To me, it's also interesting that they are descended from Ham, because we tend to think of the land of Israel being Semitic, as in descended from Shem, and generally east of that area it's true, but these nations were descended from Ham through one of his sons, Canaan. And then we've got this verse. Egypt was the father of the Luddites, the Anamites, the Lehabites, the Naphtuhites, the Pathrusites, the Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came, and the Caphtorites. So, the Philistines descended from the Casluhites. And notice there's this other brother named Caphtor. But let's start with the Casluhites. Who were they? The Casluhites or the Casluhim, depending upon your translation. Most archaeologists believe that they lived in eastern Libya. In fact, you see there on the map the Casluhim. That is just about where Tripoli is today. Josephus says that they were destroyed in a war with Egypt around 1490 BC. Take that date with a grain of salt, obviously, now. Were they annihilated by Egypt? Or did some of them survive and possibly go somewhere else? In order to be an ancestor of the Philistines, well, some of them must have survived. And then there's this other brother named Caphtor, and a really interesting reference in Amos, all the way back in Amos. Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker? And then this is confirmed by Jeremiah, that a day has come to destroy all the Philistines and to remove all survivors who could help Tyre and Sidon. The Lord is about to destroy the Philistines, the remnant from the coast of Caphtor. So tuck away for now the point that even Jeremiah, as late as he was, and Amos for that matter, is still talking about the Philistines. Did these Casluhites join their brothers, the Caphtorites? That's pure supposition on my part, and there's no clear answer on how the Philistines are affiliated, or were they somehow descended from both? And where is Caphtor? Well, you see it there on the map. The Caphtorim populated the island of Crete. And what does Crete have to do with anything? After all, we know that the Philistines, we'll end with this. The Philistines ended up populating that territory outlined by those 5 cities there: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. And that's generally north of what is currently the Gaza Strip. So what does Crete have to do with anything at all? Except God said, didn't I bring the Philistines from Crete, just like I brought Israel from Egypt, and just like I brought the Syrians from Kir. And we'll stop there. Pick up again next week. Yep.
Oh, Paul just said that Cretans were lazy gluttons, so I guess this is a description of the Philistines.
Yeah, 2,000 years later. 1,500 years later. Yeah, you're right. Thanks.